This is Winchester Academy.
Pleasure to be here tonight, and I second the fact that it's lovely to see so many people when we have one of our first nice days of the spring. So welcome to all of you. My research has mostly focused on Green Bay down through Fond du Lac, but I have managed to work in some little bits about Waupaca tonight, thanks in part to the Waupaca Historical Society. And to give you the big picture of what I'll be talking about tonight, from the time of statehood, 1848, through the end of the 19th century, there was a small but steadily growing population of African Americans in northeast Wisconsin. But that roughly half century of growth over the second half of the 1800s was followed by a precipitous decline in the number of African Americans in this region in the earliest decades of the 20th century. And ultimately, large communities, small communities, African Americans were scattered across the rural and urban landscape in northeast Wisconsin. That population shrunk to zero in community after community after community in which African Americans had once lived and worked and raised families and died and been buried. So what I want to really take us through tonight is that growth in population and then the fall in population as well. And in fact, the African American population locally has been so small for most of the 20th century that many people today don't even remember that there was a history of African American settlement here in the 19th century. It's something I certainly was not aware of until I started researching the topic. So it's really a fairly unknown part of this area's past today. But one of the things I love is that this history is actually literally inscribed still today on the local landscape in the form of place names. And if we could, what you see here is Dixie Road in Neenah, and then the next slide, Dixie Street in Fond du Lac. And these were the names given by the dominant population of these cities to neighborhoods which had sizable numbers of African American residents in the 19th century. Very clearly that dominant population associated African Americans with the South, since they chose the label Dixie for these neighborhoods. If we can go back one slide to Dixie Street in Neenah, this road, or Dixie Road rather, it gained its name when about 25 African American families lived there in the 1860s. How they came to this part of Neenah is a little less than certain. Some sources say one thing, some sources say another. But they certainly worked for a man from Chicago named Amos Snell, who owned timberland in the area, and they cleared that timberland and worked in his stave factory making barrel staves. It was a relatively short-lived community. There was a factory explosion and the business essentially wound down. But again, a population in the 1860s. If we can go to the next slide, Dixie Street in Fond du Lac. This was named after a neighborhood in which settled a number of African Americans who arrived in Fond du Lac in 1862. It was a population of about 75 people who came as, quote, contrabands of war. I don't know if you know this part of Civil War history, but as the Union troops advanced through the South, people who had until then been enslaved would go behind Union lines to be under the protection of the Union Army and to escape enslavement. And in the early years of the war, those individuals were actually returned by Union troops to their owners. They were seen as the property of their owners and were literally returned. Ironic in a war fighting slavery, right? But anyway, eventually, Union general by the name of Butler found this appalling, and so he came up with a sort of a legal notion that just recently freed slaves would be known as contraband of war, property of war. And because they were often impressed into work supporting the Confederate troops, they were obviously supporting the Confederate side in its war efforts against the federal government. And so with that notion of contrabands, and this language was then used, people could retain their freedom. So anyway, about 75 people arrived in Fond du Lac in early 1862, and many settled in this neighborhood with what becomes eventually known as Dixie Street. One last lingering example of an earlier history of African American settlement is found with Pendleton Road, also in Neenah. Peter Pendleton was a man who had both Native American and African American heritage, and he came here from the East Coast, I think Massachusetts, and settled in the 1830s. So he was one of the early non-native settlers in the area that becomes eventually Neenah. And as one of the first non-native settlers, he had a home and a hostelry, a sort of a rough inn, and he put up a lot of the early white settlers. And there's actually sort of fascinating stories about people who came in the winter and struggled through the ice and the snow, and sometimes over a frozen Lake Winnebago. Some of them would fall through the ice, and they would arrive half frozen on his doorstep. And he was the person who put up many of the very early settlers. So African Americans certainly were here from before the time of statehood, and I'd like to talk next a little bit about what brought African Americans to this part of Wisconsin. Why did people come here? And first, it's important to recognize that there are very deep roots, historically speaking, to this African American presence in this part, in what eventually becomes Wisconsin. People of African descent came here actually in the era of the fur trade with French fur traders. Some enslaved, some free, okay? And other people of African descent were independently involved in the fur trade and worked for themselves in that trade. For example, the first non-native settlers of Marinette, Wisconsin were two African American fur traders, and they traded with Native Americans in the area. They settled there in the 1790s, okay? In later years, some African Americans were brought to Wisconsin as enslaved peoples by their slave owners. This was particularly true in the southwestern part of the state, in the Lead region, okay? There were never many enslaved peoples in Wisconsin. I think, a couple of handfuls, maybe 3 handfuls. The numbers were low. But that population certainly did exist. Many fugitive slaves came to Wisconsin as well, and to northeastern Wisconsin, fleeing enslavement in the South. Free African Americans came here as well. Even before emancipation, of course, there were free black people. And some of them moved from East Coast states, other Midwestern states, to Wisconsin in hopes of a better life. I was sort of surprised when I started doing this research. My training is as an Africanist, so this is a foray into a very new area for me, doing African American history. But I began noticing in the census data, because I combed that looking for African American peoples, a number of African Americans came to northeast Wisconsin from Canada, and that is a result of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which reaffirmed that slave owners had the right to recapture fugitive slaves even in free states, in non-slave owning states like Wisconsin. And effectively that meant that anyone who had been a slave and escaped enslavement and made their way to a free state was at risk of being recaptured, re-enslaved at any point in time. And so at that time, some people chose to continue over the border into Canada, where that international border would make it much more difficult for them to be captured and returned to slavery. But anyway, both before and after emancipation, some African Americans who went to Canada came back to the States and back to Wisconsin, and that's where the roots of that population are. Things were not, wonderful in Canada either. Racism certainly existed there as well as in the United States. Not the risk of enslavement, but living in a racist society was a reality there. Okay, so people came with the fur trade, people came to escape enslavement, they came as free blacks. Others came for specific jobs, and I wanted to talk a little bit about a man named Bird Parker, who moved from Chicago to Oshkosh in 1855, okay? And he had been born into slavery in North Carolina around 1815, and when he was 30 years old in 1845, he was given a pass granting freedom of movement while he worked to earn his freedom, to buy his freedom. Okay, I don't know why his owner made that choice. I haven't found that in any of the materials so far. Anyway, he made his way from North Carolina first to Indiana and then to Chicago, where he served as an AME, African Methodist Episcopal minister, and established a school for African American children. African American children were not welcome in public schools in Chicago at that time. And he may have been involved in the Underground Railroad in Chicago and in Indiana. The evidence is a little inconclusive, but that may well have been part of what he did. When he lived in Chicago, he worked with and got to know the noted abolitionist Frederick Douglass. And so in 1854, Frederick Douglass hired Bird Parker to be the distributor of Douglass's newspaper in Illinois and Wisconsin. And that's when Bird Parker comes to Northeast Wisconsin and settles in Oshkosh, 1854 to 1855. And he did continue to work as the traveling agent, as he was called, for Douglass's newspaper. He also championed abolitionism, and he was noted for the public talks he gave on this subject throughout Wisconsin, not only in Northeast Wisconsin, but in Milwaukee. One of the Milwaukee papers who covered one of his talks said he was as good of an orator as Frederick Douglass himself. There was a big split in Wisconsin politics and among Wisconsin citizens about whether they supported abolition or not, and the Horicon Argus was a paper which was editorially very opposed to what he was lecturing about. And so in one unfortunate 1858 editorial, he was really derided and disparaged as the, quote, freedom shrieker of Oshkosh. He also had a restaurant in Oshkosh. He was no longer an AME minister at this point. So we have here one back. Thank you. The Oshkosh City Lunch. This is an ad that he ran in the Oshkosh Weekly Courier in 1855, just after arriving in the city. And I know that print is not something that you're going to be able to read, so I can just share with you part of what it says. Bird Parker respectfully announces to the citizens of Oshkosh that he has taken the building 2 doors north of Eastman's bookstore, which must have been a known landmark, and is fitting up the same for a dining saloon. I have secured the services of a competent colored cook. I'll talk a little bit about a color bar, an employment that funneled women into various kinds of domestic work, including working as cooks. So he says that he has secured the services of a competent colored cook and hope to give satisfaction to any that see fit to call. Okay. He also, if we can take a look at the next slide, served as a judge at the county fair. And one of the things that I found in my research is a really interesting mix locally of overt racism and profound racism, and at the same time in the 19th century, not so much in the 20th, integration into the community in some important ways. So we have here what would have been a precursor to a county fair. What was it called? And this is in 1859, the 5th annual cattle show and fair in Oshkosh, okay? And here we have those who are judging the poultry, and you can see at the very bottom of the image, one of the 3 judges is Bird Parker. Okay. He also owned property, which is shown in the next slide. In Oshkosh, he owned 6 lots, so he did, quite well economically. If you can see the Fulton and Irving streets there running east-west, he owned, all 6 lots right in here. This street, this north-south street didn't exist, so he owned lots 10, 11, 12, 34, 35, and or 31, 32, and 33. And that was property that was, of some considerable value. He died, unfortunately, in the 1859, 1860, somewhere in there, before seeing the success of emancipation and abolition in this country. Okay, his children, however, continued his history of civic engagement. And this is his daughter, Lillian Thomas Fox. She grew up in Oshkosh and worked from age 15 there as a hairdresser. That was another job that African-American women were disproportionately steered into. But she went on from there to significant achievements. She moved to Indiana as an adult. And she was, among other things, a reporter and correspondent for the Indianapolis News from 1900 to 1914. And she is believed to have been the first African-American journalist to write for what was in that day called a white daily newspaper in Indiana. And she covered the black community in Indiana extensively. She also lectured widely, as did her father. She lectured throughout the Midwest and in the West, so maybe even on a bigger scale geographically than he did. And she spoke about African-American suffrage and constitutional rights. She also spoke at Frederick Douglass's memorial service. He was a family friend as well as somebody who hired her father. And she was an organizing member of the Indianapolis Anti-Lynching League as well. Bird Parker had a son, also Bird Parker Jr., and he was imprisoned in 1877, so sometime after his father's death. When he was a young man, he was imprisoned for 5 years on charges of passing a counterfeit $5 bill. That's a fairly hefty term. And I thought this was interesting. This is his prison conduct record, 1877 to 1878. If you had a spotless prison conduct record, you got a couple of things in return. You might get released early, about 9 months early in his case, and you could have your rights of citizenship restored. We talk and hear a lot nowadays about what it means that convicted felons cannot vote unless they're pardoned. And given the rates of incarceration for black men today, we have a huge population of disenfranchised voters. In Wisconsin at this point in time, if you had a clean conduct record, you were pretty automatically granted a pardon by the governor to restore your rights of citizenship, including the right to vote. So a lot was at stake with behaving, as you were expected to in prison. You might get out earlier, you could have your rights of citizenship restored. But also, I think in keeping with his father's and his sister's social activism, he does have 3 write-ups, and the middle one is the one that I wanted to draw your attention to. He's reported by McDonald, must have been one of the guards, for feeding a man on solitary. Okay, so even though that was going to rebound to, not to his interest, he did feed a man on solitary, and he was black marked, as it says, as a result. There's something else that's interesting on here. I was surprised when I saw this. So he was sentenced in 77 to 5 years, so that would take him up to 82 normally, right? But he was discharged on presidential pardon, May 7th, 1878. And this was the President of the United States presidential pardon, okay? And the president at the time was Rutherford Hayes. And Rutherford Hayes had worked before he was president as a criminal lawyer and as president of the National Prison Association. And Hayes was fully aware of and recognized institutional and widespread racial and ethnic inequities in the U.S. judicial system. And so he was known as president for pardoning a significant number of African Americans and Native Americans who had been convicted of crimes, and Bird Parker Jr. was one of those individuals. And again, we still talk so much today about inequities in the judicial system, racially based inequities in the judicial system, 140 years after this case, nearly 140 years after. Okay, so anyway, my bigger trajectory here, though, was why did African Americans come to Northeast Wisconsin? Bird Parker Sr., because of a specific job, okay? A couple of other categories of people who came here. Some came with white settler families. And I wanted to talk about an African-American woman by the name of Evelyn Sheckler. She was the first person I found in the census data when I started this research. And she shows up in De Pere living with a white family, the Loy family. Okay, so again, I was new to local history, and the archivist at the archives I was working at that day said, oh, the Loys, they're a pretty prominent De Pere family, the family she was living with. And so I sort of poked around online and in the Wisconsin Historical Society collections and found that they had boxes and boxes and boxes of papers about the Loy family, that son of the Loys who moved here from Pennsylvania had donated when he was close to death. And so I thought, I'll see if I can find anything about Evelyn Sheckler in the family papers. And I thought that was maybe a long shot, but they wrote about her extensively. There was tons of information about her. So how did she come to be living with the Loys how did Evelyn Sheckler come to be living with the Loys in De Pere in the 1850s and certainly the 1850s? The Loys had moved here from Pennsylvania, and I was talking with one of the board members of this organization over dinner, and he's been doing research into Pennsylvania Dutch history and German history in Pennsylvania. So Mrs. Loy, her maiden name was Schell, so she was from a German Pennsylvania family. And her father was an abolitionist, and there were 2 orphan siblings, African-American children, Evelyn Sheckler and her brother. the father of the woman who eventually moves here and becomes Mrs. Loy, he took those 2 children in. And so when I looked at the family papers, what I saw over and over again is that, if we can go to the next slide, again, I don't know how well you can make this out from the audience, but this is, so the Loys senior move here. They have 5 sons. One of them is the one who saves the family papers and annotates them and donates them to the Wisconsin Historical Society. So he grew up as a child in the home of his parents and Evelyn Sheckler, who had been raised with his mother, you know, taken into the family, adopted by the family. And so he says about Evelyn, she was a second mother to all of us boys in our family, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So he saw her in this document as a second mother, okay? But not surprisingly, she had an ambiguous status in this white family, okay? And although she was called a second mother over and over, and people wrote lovingly, members of the family wrote lovingly about her in letters they passed back and forth, and the man back in Pennsylvania who had adopted her wanted to make sure she inherited the property she'd left in his house when she moved to Wisconsin with her adoptive sister and her sister's family. It was complicated because she was essentially also a servant working for the family. She was like a nanny to the children, unpaid. She was a cook, unpaid. So she had this very, very ambiguous status, and it's made evident in what I want to show you next. So we have the Loys who live here, Rebecca and her husband David, and Rebecca's the one who was raised with Evelyn. And then they have their son, Peter, who's the one who saves the family papers. And Peter moves to California in his later years, and clearly, you know, thoughts of mortality are kind of weighing on him, and he's thinking about where he will be buried, where his mortal remains will rest. And he knew that there was a family plot in Green Bay, at Woodlawn Cemetery in Green Bay. And so, you know, many years after he had left the area, he wrote a letter to the cemetery manager saying, I know we have a family, you know, plot. Could you tell me how many burial sites are left, and et cetera, et cetera. And the guy writes back and says, well, I'm terribly sorry to tell you this, but, you know, you have to pay so much money a year by Wisconsin law to retain the right to those plots. And your family kind of lost track of it, and no one's paid anything in many, many years. And so we've sold those lots. They're no longer yours. So in the process of going through this correspondence, you know, Peter had said, she's like a second mother to me, and I love her dearly. And, you know, he would inquire after her all the time when he wrote home. And he mentioned that the family had paid for a marble tombstone and had buried her in the family plot in Green Bay when she died. Okay, so that sounds inclusive, maybe, right? But what he included in the papers was a sketch of the family plot, and we have up here the parents and some of the siblings. A lot of those boys did not survive childhood and died in childhood. So this is where the members of the immediate family are buried. And where is Evelyn? She's down here. Okay, she's stuck in the far corner. So anyway, the irony perhaps is when the cemetery manager wrote to him many years, decades later, and said, sorry, you've lost those other lots. He also said, well, you know, because one member of the family was you know, physically separated from the rest, when we sold the lots, we disinterred her and buried her by the other family members. So if you go to the next slide, you can see these are the Loy family member plots. These are 2 of the boys who die in childhood, who Evelyn helped to raise, and this is Evelyn's stone right here. And if you go to the next one, that's just a close-up of her tombstone. So, a complicated situation, as you can imagine. Okay, so many, many different motivations that individuals had for coming to Northeast Wisconsin. I'd like to switch gears a little bit here and talk about the kinds of work that African Americans did after settling here. And I mentioned this already. Although the kinds of work people did was highly varied, there was absolutely an informal color bar. In apartheid South Africa, we talk about a formal color bar that was legally, you know, mandated. But there was an informal but effective color bar here that steered disproportionate numbers of African American men into work as laborers, okay? And men did very many different kinds of labor, working as janitors, as porters, as day laborers, as farm workers, in quarries and factories, shoe shine stands, a lot of different things. But there was an informal thing that steered men into, specific kinds of work. Women also faced that, and I mentioned this already too, but African American women were steered into mainly domestic work, working as maids, as servants, laundresses, cooks, etc. Okay. So the color line was real. It also did not ensnare everyone. And you've already heard about somebody who was not, encompassed in that color bar, Bird Parker, who was a minister and a newspaper agent and an abolitionist and a restaurant owner. Okay. Some people went into farming as well. There were certainly a number of African Americans in this part of the state who owned property, who owned farms. Some were small business owners. There was a man in Oshkosh who was a confectioner, another man who was a photographer. And if we were to go east a bit and jump across Lake Winnebago to Chilton, Wisconsin, I don't know if any of you know the history of the founding of Chilton, but the first non-native settler there was a man, an African American man, Moses Stanton, who settled there and built a sawmill and a grist mill. And in fact, Chilton used to be named Stantonville in recognition of Moses Stanton, the first settler there. Later on, an English immigrant arrived from Chillington in England, and he wished to honor his hometown, and the town was renamed Chilton, a sort of shortened version of his name. So that connection to Moses Stanton in naming was lost at that point in time. But anyway, he did make a good living from his sawmill and his grist mill there. Okay. Though most of the jobs most readily available to African American men did not pay well, the occupation of barber, which was also a job that African American men were steered into, could lead to considerable wealth. And they weren't just steered into it, they chose it deliberately. And so this, I can connect us a little bit to Waupaca. One of the people who lived here in the 19th century was an African American man by the name of James Paris. And he was born in Kentucky in 1842 in Louisville. I don't know if he was free or born into slavery, but he did move with his parents to Chicago when he was just a toddler. And as a teenager served a 3-year apprentice with a barber in Chicago. And so he became, a fully trained barber. And I don't know how he decided to come to this part of the state, but in 1861 he went to New London and worked as a barber there for a year. And a year later, in 1862, he moved to Waupaca, continuing to work as a barber here, and spent the rest of his life here in Waupaca. He clearly made a good living. The 1870 census, again, he came in 1862, but by 1870, he was living in a hotel owned by a Frank Vosburg, and there were a number of people who were professionals of various kinds who lived in this hotel. And some of the censuses list the value of your property, many do not, but the 1870 census does. And at that time, James Paris had real estate valued at $1,000 and personal property valued at $450, which made him one of the wealthier residents of the hotel. Most of the people boarding there owned no property. Okay. He was married 2 years later in 1874, and again, I've just started looking into the life history of James Paris, so what I'm finding is some inconsistencies, which is not unexpected when you do historical research, but I haven't had time to tease out, what the accurate story is yet. But anyway, on his marriage certificate, he's listed as a saloon keeper, which is somewhat surprising because census data on both sides of his marriage date shows him to be a barber. Anyway, by 1880, he had moved out of the hotel and had his own household with his wife, and they had one son at that point in time. They eventually had 2 sons and a daughter. Some of the ambiguity over racial identity in this country can be found in census data as well. And often, census takers didn't ask people what their identity was. They ascribed the identity they believed was correct to the person that they were enumerating. So James married a white woman, Anna, whose parents were immigrants from Ireland. That's a pattern I see here repeatedly in Northeast Wisconsin, many marriages between African Americans and white immigrants. Anyway, so he was listed as black, his wife Anna was listed as white, his 2 sons were listed as black, and his daughter as white. Typically the children of, mixed marriages, racially mixed marriages, were identified as mulatto, as were a lot of African American people in general. But the census taker wasn't sure what to do with this family. James Paris became a respected member of the Waupaca community, and he ran for office here in 1899 and was elected to the position of alderman for Waupaca's first ward. He ran 2 years later and was reelected in 1901, and then retired from politics after serving for 4 years. But he was written up in the papers regularly, as you can imagine, and I just thought I'd share with you a snippet from one piece. This was written in 1901 after his second election. Mr. Paris has been a resident of Waupaca for the last 40 years and is one of its most respected citizens. He has just been elected alderman for the second time and enjoys the confidence and esteem of the mayor, of whom he was a classmate. I haven't yet made sense of that statement. Since he came here as an adult. Mr. Paris is one of the most elaborate barbershops in the city and has, by strict attention to business acumen, accumulated property to the amount of at least $15,000. And this is in 1901. We observed from the mayor's committee appointments that Mr. Paris was appointed chairman of 2 of the most important committees, and he was also a Mason of high degree. Okay, and I should have asked you to forward one more slide. Oh, we can skip over that one. That's James Paris. Okay. All right. His occupation as a barber may well have helped him to gain the political positions he did. There's a really interesting book about black barbers that's been recently published called Knights of the Razor, Black Barbers in Slavery and Freedom. And the book makes the point that the occupation of barber put barbers into very close and regular routine and intimate, if you will, personal contact with their clients. And in the 19th century, black barbers pretty successfully shut out most white barbers in serving white elites, okay? And so it gave barbers close ties to white clients. It allowed for entrepreneurship, as I've talked about, and the development of considerable wealth if you owned your own barbershop. After emancipation in the South, black barbers were on the forefront of Reconstruction politics, and that's essentially a parallel to what we see here with James Paris in Waupaca. Okay, so although some people rose to considerable wealth, Richard Dunn was an African-American man who was a farmer in Rushford, and in 1870 he owned a farm there that was worth $3,000. Thomas Jordan, another man, owned a farm in Menasha in 1870 valued at $3,500. Although we do see, you know, these instances, it should be recognized that if you aggregate the census data, certainly African-Americans held considerably less wealth than did white Americans. Okay. All right, so I would like to turn my attention next to how African Americans were received in the dominantly, indeed overwhelmingly, white communities to which they came, or in the case of Chilton, founded. Okay, and the reaction of Wisconsinites was definitely mixed. And I'll talk about some of the pros and some of the cons, starting on the plus side. I don't know if you've heard of the so-called black laws that were enacted in many Midwestern states that were explicitly designed to keep African Americans out. They did things like demand that you have written proof that you were free, very hard to come by. They sometimes demanded that you post a bond of $500 to live in that state. In the 19th century, that's an insurmountable amount of money for many people. If you're charged with being a slave, you don't necessarily have the right to testify and introduce witnesses in your own defense. So the black laws in Midwestern states were absolutely designed to minimize an African American population in those states. So on the plus side, Wisconsin did not enact black laws. And Wisconsin was, in fact, the only Midwestern state without legal segregation in its public school system. And local data consistently shows African American children attending local public schools. And African Americans in Wisconsin had some of the rights of citizenship denied to African Americans in many other states. For example, in Wisconsin, African Americans could serve on juries even before getting the vote, okay, which happened in 1866. And this lack of these very punitive black laws presumably was a draw to some African Americans who chose to come to Wisconsin. I've talked with a colleague who's doing similar work in southern Wisconsin, and he said that there is strong evidence that in the southern part of the state, local communities, if not state laws, often were developed that were parallel to the kinds of black laws I just discussed. So this is probably something with regional variation within the state, and it's something people are really just starting to look into. But on the positive side, less codified racism than in most nearby states. And there are some interesting examples of integration. If you think back to Peter Pendleton, after whom Pendleton Road in Neenah was named, he came here again in the 1830s. He voted in the first town meeting ever held in Neenah in 1847, almost 20 years before African Americans got the vote here. And his vote was allowed and recognized by all the other voters were white, okay? And his name appears unambiguously on the, quote, poll list of actual voters at the first election in Neenah. Very interestingly, one of the items up for vote was on what was called colored suffrage. 34 votes were given in favor of it and 13 votes against it. Then he would have known who voted what, and he was living with all of those neighbors. Okay. He's also said to have voted in Oshkosh before Neenah was created as a municipality, and again, this is way before African American men got the vote in 1866. He had a son, Robert, who continued this family tradition, if you will, of voting in elections. He voted in Appleton in 1857, about a decade before African Americans got the vote. And although there were people who challenged his right to vote, the poll workers upheld it. It was against the law, but they upheld it. They thought he should have the right to vote. Okay. It's always this, but on the other hand, right? So on the other hand, one of those newly arrived settlers who Peter Pendleton put up in his hostelry demonstrated, I guess I would say, multiple bigotries when he described Peter Pendleton's wife, who was of mixed Native American and African American heritage, as a, quote, large, fat, half-breed Negro wench. And Pendleton himself was widely known as Black Pete. So it's a mixed bag at best. Another, to me, somewhat surprising example of integration in area communities is that individual African Americans in Northeast Wisconsin were regularly mentioned in sort of the comings and goings section of newspapers. That was often on the front page of local newspapers in the 19th century, and it would say, John Smith went to visit his father in, Eau Claire or whatever this weekend. He will be back a week from Monday. So it was just sort of so-and-so has been sick, so-and-so has recovered from an injury or an illness, whatever it might be. And there were individuals who were regularly written up in a very routine kind of commonplace way, African American individuals in local newspapers. So one of these people is a man by the name of Henry Sink, who I've researched his life extensively, and he has a Waupaca connection actually too at the very end of his life. He came to Fond du Lac in 1864. Well, we know he was in Fond du Lac by 1864 because he signed up for service in the Civil War. And you probably may know that African Americans were not allowed to serve in that war on the Union side until the North got desperate for more troops, right? And there were also people who wanted to buy their way out by paying somebody else to serve in their place to avoid the horror of warfare, okay? So he was living in Fond du Lac in 1864 when he enlisted in what were called the USCT, the United States Colored Troops, segregated regiments. He had been born into slavery in Arkansas. I don't know how he made his way to Wisconsin and why he came to Fond du Lac. He might have been one of those so-called contrabands, the timing is right, but I'm not sure. So he spends over a decade in Fond du Lac. After he returns from Civil War service, he was grievously injured. He was shot through the elbow and had a fused elbow, so he could only, move his hand like this. But he did all kinds of work nonetheless. He worked as a fireman in a factory in Fond du Lac, feeding the factory fires. He eventually moves north and spends some decades towards the end of his life in Green Bay and De Pere. He shoveled snow for the city of De Pere and did a variety of other things. But anyway, he was somebody who was routinely written up in the De Pere and Brown County newspapers. when he and his wife traveled. And finally, this is the Waupaca Connection. He was a veteran, and of course, this audience will know about the Veterans Home at King, right? And so he ended up there in 1904 and 1905, the last 2 years of his life. And the papers in De Pere noted his, the fact that he was leaving. He and his wife were leaving. This home was founded to include the wives and widows of Civil War vets, as well as the vets themselves, the first one in the country to do that, right? Because it served indigent veterans. And if they were let in, but their wives were not, those wives often ended up in poorhouses, literally, okay? And so he and his wife both lived in the Veterans Home at King. He came back to visit friends in De Pere. The paper noted that, and when he died, they noted that and published sort of an obituary. Okay. And this, again, I've found for many individuals, not just Henry Sink, not just James Paris here in Waupaca. You might wonder about what Henry Sink is wearing. That is the uniform of the GAR, the Grand Army of the Republic, which was a fraternal organization for Union Civil War veterans who had been honorably discharged. And this is the GAR portrait, actually, of Henry Sink. He belonged to the De Pere GAR. There are certainly many racially integrated GAR posts to be found in the North, but many were not. And somewhat interestingly, I found a lot of integrated ones in northeast Wisconsin. De Pere, Appleton, Oshkosh, Fond du Lac, Peshtigo, farther afield, Eagle River and Baraboo. And these are just ones that I've sort of stumbled across. I haven't, systematically investigated this. Again, on the other side, although African Americans were in local GAR posts that were dominantly white, the degree of their integration into those posts is not clear. Often African American post members do not appear in group photos and parade shots. Again, on the plus side, I've talked about the fact that public schools were open to both white and black school children in Wisconsin. But interestingly, the next slide shows something even more than that. This is from the Oshkosh Northwestern in 1871, a short piece, 3 full-grown colored men are attending the First Ward School. So Oshkosh schools were actually open to African American adults. And you probably know that it was illegal to teach slaves how to read and write in this country before emancipation and the end of slavery. And so many people assiduously pursued educations when it was available to them. And ever since I've come across this little piece, I've wondered if one of those men in Oshkosh might have been the person who's in the next slide, Willis Fitch. He is also in his GAR uniform here. He was a member of one of the GAR posts in Oshkosh. And Civil War pension files are a rich, rich, rich source of information when you want to find out about the lives of any Civil War veterans. And Willis Fitch's file tells that he was enslaved in Alabama. He becomes a member of a USCT when Union troops are close to where he was enslaved. And he tells in his pension file, these are often like 100 pages long, you had to prove you had the right to a pension, and if you were injured, you had to get checkups on an annual basis and so on. And often people who knew you are testifying about the fact that you really are eligible for one of these pensions. So anyway, he said that the minute he was discharged, and he served in the South, of course, he got on a train and came to Oshkosh within 5 days of being discharged. Again, he'd lived his life in Alabama. So why he decided on Oshkosh, I don't know. I assume somebody he served with probably said, this is a place you want to be. It was known in one person's interesting turn of phrase as a live wire town at that point before it went on its downhill trajectory. So anyway, he comes to Oshkosh and he spends most of the rest of his life there. He does all kinds of things there. He was a firefighter, not with factory fires, but he was a member of the firefighting, one of the firefighting squads in Oshkosh. He did a whole bunch of different things. But anyway, his pension file tells us that he had been enslaved and, quote, only learned to read and write since I came to Oshkosh. Okay, and that's why I wonder if he was attending that school. All right. Higher education beyond grade school, beyond high school, was sometimes available to African American in the States as well, which brings us back to Waupaca once again and Lawrence University in Appleton. Lawrence University enrolled at least 2 African American students in the 19th century and early 20th century, perhaps more. One was the son of Peter Pendleton, who I've already talked about. He did not have a happy experience there and was essentially hounded for racist reasons and, forced to leave. But the other African American at Lawrence I've come across was Claude Paris, the son of Waupaca's James Paris, who was an alderman and barber here. Okay, the Waupaca Record newspaper in 1903. Claude, the son, was born in 1880, so he would have been 23 at this time. But anyway, one of the Waupaca papers said that he had gained distinction in scholarship, declamation, and athletics. While a high school student, he worked for his father for 3 years training as a barber, continued training as a barber in Stevens Point. He was apparently a very good basketball player. He played for the Stevens Point City team, which won the national championship in 1901, and he was listed as one of the 5 best players. But he had always wanted to go to college. And so after these experiences, when he would have been, about 21 or something like that, 22, he enrolled at Lawrence in the fall of 1902 and spent 2 years there. Some sources say he was studying for the ministry, which, like work as a barber, gave African American men in the time of a firm color bar another route to middle class status and middle class economic stability. So some sources say he was studying for the ministry, others say for electrical engineering, so take your pick. Again, hopefully I can figure that out, but I don't have the last word yet. And ultimately he followed in his father's footsteps and came back to Waupaca and worked as a barber here. I'm sorry, I should have asked you to forward the slideshow. Okay, since I forgot these, just going back to Willis Fitch gaining his literacy. If you were not literate, how did you sign? In the 1860s, 70s, 80s, you had Willis Fitch, his mark, and then there's an X in the middle. So this is 1864, some of his Civil War papers, and then the next slide shows him with this signature in 1872, a kind of a copperplate signature. Okay, Henry Sink gained his literacy here as well. But anyway, moving on, this is Claude Paris when he was at Lawrence. He played basketball there as well. And we have him here. Okay. And this is him in old age. He was 89, and he was written up in the Appleton Post-Crescent, and he was confined to a wheelchair at this point in his life. But he was a big sports fan, and so he's cheering on some team. He said he was a Packers fan, some other teams as well. Okay, and the next slide shows his son. Okay, so we have James and then Claude and then Kenneth, his son, who was born in, I think, 1911. Okay, the importance ascribed to race is made clear. Whoever notated this photograph says mixed parents, black, white. Okay, and then father was a barber at the Veterans Home. And I told you Henry Sink, who spent time in Fond du Lac and De Pere, ended up at the Veterans Home at the end of his life, and he was here in 1904 to 1905, and another source says that Claude started working as a barber at the Veterans Home in 1905, so I always wondered if he and Henry Sink crossed paths while they were both there. Okay, so as I said, some examples of integration into communities in ways like serving as judges at the county fair and being noted in unremarkable ways in the newspaper and all of that kind of stuff. But on the other side of the ledger, it is unquestionably true that both casual and institutionalized racism existed in Northeast Wisconsin in the 19th and early 20th centuries, unsurprisingly, because that was true, of course, across the country as a whole. I mentioned interracial marriages a moment ago, that they were quite common, but they often received sensationalist and highly negative newspaper coverage, okay? And families sometimes, rejected, white families sometimes rejected family members who married across race lines. Racial slurs and stereotypes can be found in many articles. A popular form of entertainment in 19th century Wisconsin was minstrel shows, which deal in stereotypes of African Americans for sure. And there were fairly regular, if unsuccessful, attempts to introduce legislation in Wisconsin limiting the blacks of rights along the lines of the black laws of other Midwestern states. Those were not successful, but the desire was there and frequently expressed. In 1857, Wisconsinites voted to deny the vote to African American men. That was not the only time that happened. And there was an incident I've come across here in Waupaca in 1858. It involved Edward Hunter, an African American man who was identified in the newspaper as the village barber. So James Paris actually had a predecessor, right? And he was giving a speech on the eve of the 4th of July, on the night of July 3rd in 1858, and it was a public talk, and he was up on some kind of dais, some kind of platform outside, and when two young men attacked him, okay, one of whom was a teacher in the local school district, and they decided to pelt him with what the paper described as firecrackers, squibs, which I had to look up. I had no idea what a squib was. It's a kind of a firework that makes those kind of a noise, I guess, and what they described as other missiles. And he was forced to stop his address and step down from the stand and go home, okay? But this did not meet with widespread approval in Waupaca, so he was invited to speak again by supportive members of the community on the 5th of July with a supportive audience in attendance. And the young men who had attacked him didn't bother him when, you know, he was had a supportive crowd around him, but they did follow him home and pelted him with rotten eggs. They were arrested and tried and found guilty. And, you know, the write-up in the paper was critical of the young men who harassed him, okay? But community support aside, and the outcome of that particular instance aside, this kind of harassment would have been a constant in the lives of African Americans here in the 19th century. To give you another example of that, some of the African Americans who arrived in Fond du Lac in 1862 as, quote, contrabands of war, were interviewed, and one of them said, quote, that when we first arrived, we couldn't walk along the street without having someone jeering at us and calling out, "Sambo, take that chalk out of your eye," or something like that. The white reverend who brought them to Fond du Lac, he had been a chaplain in the Civil War and worked with so-called contrabands. He had a rock thrown through his window after that as well. And there was a debate topic in 1879 in Fond du Lac that certainly spoke to at least some white Fond du Lac residents' sentiments. It was resolved that the colored population would be more benefited by colonization than by their present condition. In other words, a desire to remove African Americans from this country, send them back to Africa. And I could go on. I'm keeping an eye on the time, and I have other things I want to talk about. But certainly, the lives of African Americans here would have been profoundly and routinely affected by racism. Okay, so I told you the population grows over the second half of the 19th century and then plummets in the early decades of the 20th century. And that was probably for many reasons. Demographers talk about push-pull, you know, factors. Something pulls you to another place because you have opportunity there, jobs, whatever it might be. Something pushes you to another place when you're not welcome in the place where you live. And I'm sure both of those factors were operating in Northeast Wisconsin in the early 20th century. But it's also very important to know that the late 19th and early 20th centuries following Reconstruction after the Civil War were times of horrifically worsening race relations in the United States, when there's a profound backlash against the gains being made by African Americans following emancipation and in Reconstruction, okay? And this backlash took the form of Jim Crow laws in the South, but I think that there were counterparts to Jim Crow in the North, and they occurred in Northeast Wisconsin as well as in other parts of the North. Because what we see in the 20th century here is increased police harassment. I don't know if any of you have seen the Appleton traveling museum exhibition, A Stone of Hope. It's fabulous if you haven't seen it. And if you look at the museum's website, you can see where it is in the community. It's still going around. But increased police harassment, increased discrimination in employment, increased discrimination in housing. And this all caused African Americans to leave here in completely disproportionate numbers. We do not see an equivalent crash in the white population, so that tells you this is racialized, right? So if we go to the next slide, you see the pattern that's found. African Americans in Fond du Lac County, I don't know if you can see the scale on the left is from 0 to 250. Then we start from 1850 and go up to 1960. So this pattern of a growing population to above 200 African Americans in Fond du Lac County in 1870 and 1880 is followed by a drop. There's a blip up in 1900 or 1910, and I have to do more research into local conditions to find out why that might be, and then dropping down again. And if we look at the next slide, that shows Calumet County with a peak population of 320 or so in 1880, and then that precipitous drop. These numbers here, 40, 50, 60, 10, that's one person. Okay, and then the next slide I gave you Waupaca County. The numbers are small. The scale on the left goes from 0 to 20. Okay, so I did a talk in Door County, and you have similar numbers to Door County. But anyway, you can see again the general pattern of a rise in population through 1890, a drop, an exception of 1910, but the gradual trajectory is, downward from that peak of 1890 and 1910. And these are not, this is a pattern found in counties across northeast Wisconsin. These are not cherry-picked examples. Okay. Reflective of the increased racism that followed Reconstruction is the fact that the Klan had a brief heyday in the Fox River Valley in the mid-1920s. It was short-lived for sure, but the Klan was very active in Oshkosh between 1924 and 1926. And here is an image from the Oshkosh Public Museum of Klansmen in that city. The Klan in Oshkosh is said to have numbered about 2,700 local residents, okay? And in the summer of 1924, the Klan conducted many cross burnings, including, well, the Klan was also active in Fond du Lac, and where was one of the crosses burned in Fond du Lac? On Dixie Street, okay? That's certainly not accidental. The Oshkosh Klan had many cross burnings, open air meetings. They burned a 60-foot tall cross at one of their so-called convocations, which was, they had a convocation on July 4th, 1925. They like to wrap themselves in the guise of patriotism. Okay, so they chose July 4th intentionally. And there's one more slide, which is from that convocation. Women were certainly active in the Klan as well as men. And that 1925 convocation drew 20,000 people from across the state. I found newspaper accounts of cross burnings in many places, including in Larrabee here in Waupaca County in 1924. It was blamed on a Klan group in Clintonville. We were just talking about Clintonville over dinner. Okay, and I should point out that this is after most African Americans leave northeast Wisconsin. This is not the cause of people leaving, but it's a reflection of the climate and the worsening climate in the 20th century. Okay, and I should also point out that in addition to African Americans, Catholics were targeted and taverns were targeted. In fact, it was a tavern that had a cross burned outside it in Larrabee, and bootleggers were targeted. But the Klan was widely and with a lot of sort of sensationalism covered in the local papers in the 20s when it had this spike in Wisconsin, and people would have known full well its racist ideology as well. Okay. And then to, again, put this in the context of a larger national narrative, there's an extremely ugly history of what I think we can rightly call racial cleansing in the United States post-Reconstruction, when a whole host of U.S. communities forcibly expel their African American populations. I don't know if any of you saw the movie about Rosewood, Florida that came out in the 90s. It was about one of these expulsions. There were prominent other expulsions in Evansville, Indiana, in East St. Louis, Illinois, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and many, many other communities where people were told you have to leave. And if they did not, they were beaten, they were killed, people were raped, their property was burned, and people were literally forced out from violence. And this is a pattern we see in the South and the North. The horrific history of lynchings in this country. Not a lot of substantiated lynchings in Wisconsin, but in 1920, 3 African-American men who worked for a traveling circus, it had stopped in Sturgeon Bay, and just a week later they were in Duluth, Minnesota, and those 3 men were lynched there. You can find a lot of information about that online. So, you know, my thinking is that the decline in the African-American population locally is absolutely a local manifestation of a national phenomenon. Part of this is the creation of what are known as sundown towns. I don't know if that's a term you're familiar with, some of you definitely, where African Americans were welcome in town, but only until sundown, which meant you could not live there. Your labor might be desired, okay, so you were allowed in during the day, but then you were not allowed to live in that community. James Lowen has written some really seminal stuff on sundown towns. Locally, Appleton is a known sundown town, okay, and there's just abundant evidence of that. I have not come across any other firm evidence of sundown towns, but that does not mean they did not exist. James Lowen certainly thinks there were other ones here, and again, I've just, you know, been doing this research so long, so this is not the last word on that topic. But the result of all of this is that in the 20th century, African Americans became increasingly unwelcome in the cities and villages and rural townships in this area that had been their homes. If we can go to the next image, I told you Henry Sink, well, I very briefly mentioned Henry Sink bought a home in De Pere in 1900, okay? It was covered in the community paper, unremarkably, just like other people's purchases of homes were covered. And less than a half a mile south of where Henry Sink owned a home to apparent community acceptance in 1900, what do we have in 1948? A new De Pere subdivision. And again, I don't know that you'll be able to make this out, but what does it say, A here? No persons of any race other than Gentiles of the Caucasian race, so no Jews as well, shall use or occupy any building or any lot, except that this covenant shall not prevent occupancy by domestic servants of a different race domiciled with an owner or tenant. Okay, so again, a desire for labor, but not a desire for residential coexistence, other than in that unequal, you know, servant employer setting. One more image, and these are just ones I've stumbled across talking with people about my research, and oh, I remember hearing this. This is a former colleague of mine, a now retired colleague of mine at the college, who, when I was talking with him about this, says, oh, my own homes title has this in it. These are not enforceable. The Supreme Court ruled against restrictive covenants in 1948, but from 1932 in Alloway, another racially restrictive covenant. And then one more image along these lines. Comes from the Lakeview Memorial Park in Oshkosh. And I can't read this date, which just, I really wish I could. So 19 something, I'm not sure what. But what does this cemetery plot agreement say? So they've sold this plot in this park in Oshkosh, the same to be used for the burial of the bodies or ashes of human beings of the white race and no other. So segregation after death as well as in life. I know somebody who's a specialist in African American history who grew up in Wausau, and he said this also was the norm in Wausau cemeteries, or at least some of them. Okay. So I hope I've made it clear that, you know, in the 19th century, life here was anything but a utopia when it came to race. But the 19th century was also better than what followed in the 20th century. So in contradistinction to this Lakeview Memorial Park racially restrictive covenant, I want to return for a moment to Oshkosh's Riverside Cemetery, which was open to the mortal remains of African Americans, white Americans, and Native Americans alike in the 19th century. And that it is there that we find the grave of the 1850s Oshkosh resident who, among other claims to fame, was an abolitionist, a reverend, a restaurant and property owner, and a judge of poultry at the country fair. And we have the gravestone of Bird Parker here. So thank you.
We do have a few minutes for a couple of questions. If anyone would have a question they'd like to present, bring the mic.
I'm curious as to whether the fellow named Saint, who wound up his life at the Veterans Home, is buried there.
He's not. He was actually kicked out of the home about 8 weeks before he died. It's clear from coverage in the Green Bay and De Pere papers that although he was a liked member of the community, he also had a drinking problem. And he was, you weren't supposed to drink alcohol at the home, and he did, and I think he did repeatedly. So they dishonorably just discharged him in the military parlance of the house. And so he went back to his first known home in Wisconsin, Fond du Lac, and spent the last like 8 weeks of his life there. And he's buried in Rienzi Cemetery outside of Fond du Lac.
Do you know if there are any black burials happening?
I don't know. It certainly was, you know, they took black veterans as well as white veterans, which not all homes did. But I don't know about the burials.
Finished his life at King, but I don't know that he
Yeah.
buried there. Maybe somebody died.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
I was wondering if you had come across, I think it was an early settler named Jackson, and it was what freedom was named for.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes. So that's, you know, along with Chilton, another area community that was named after an African-American resident. And I think the community had a different name, or it wasn't yet incorporated, one or the other. And, you know, the story is that people asked him, what do you want to name it? And that he said freedom, because that's what he found here. Yeah. I'll look into the Tuskegee Airmen and burial, though. Thank you.
I think he was buried back where he came from, but
Okay.
I would, you know, it would be interesting to know
Yeah.
if there are some, but
Yeah.
We have another question back here.
The lack of diversity in our community is disturbing, and I'm wondering if anyone has studied the reason why it continues. I actually worked after Katrina to try to welcome some people who were displaced into the Salvation Army in Milwaukee, and no one wanted to come. We worked really hard through churches to welcome people to central Wisconsin, and did not succeed, but that's the only experience I've had. But I was very disturbed when I moved here 12 years ago to see the lack of diversity. And of course, for our children, they're growing up in this environment without diversity. So is anyone studying that?
I'm sure people have and are. It's not research I've looked at myself, but I know back in the 50s there were some studies of this sort that were done, and I would be, you know, very surprised if things haven't been done more recently, but I'm not familiar with them. Do you know from the work you've done, were people asked why they didn't want to resettle here, and do you know what they said?
Just, you know, they didn't want to come north.
Yeah, yeah.
So it was, you know, it may be connected to what
Yeah.
it's like.
And people, you know, people did come north, as I've been talking about, in the 19th century, and they stayed here until it was no longer a hospitable place. So, you know, people do say that, and I'm not attributing this to you, but it's a specious argument, of course. Green Bay, I moved there in 1989, so I've been there over a quarter century, and its population has shifted dramatically in that period of time. Dramatically, the Green Bay public schools are now, quote, majority minority. So there's movement in some area communities and not in others, but that's an interesting question, but I don't have an answer for it. Yeah.
I was just going to say, I just adopted 4 African-American children through the foster care system. And before we brought them into our home, we actually prayed with our church about bringing them into Waupaca because we don't have a big diversity. And would that be good for them or not good for them to bring them to this area? So they were very welcomed within our church, and that's why we have them. But God moved us in that direction. But I still, you know, kind of get concerned sometimes. So far, the community's welcomed them with open arms. We haven't had any problems with any racism or anything. So, but that was one of my questions, because I'm not originally from here, so I didn't know the history, and that's kind of why I came tonight, just to kind of feel it out a little bit more.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, there was one more question up front, and then we're going to have to close for the evening.
what were the marital laws? Were they by county or state?
I'm guessing state, but I don't know. But certainly, you know, interracial marriages were legal. They were solemnified by justices of the peace and by religious authorities. So I'm guessing it was a statewide legality, but I'm not sure. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. Vicki, give her a